Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. So, I am Andrea Swanner. I am the founder and lead consultant of Andrea Swanner Consulting. I'm located here in Texas, very near Dallas. I am a business strategist, an operational aficionado, a visibility vixen, a thought partner offering concierge level support and hands on support for my clients. My mission is to empower passionate women to business brilliance by providing clarity and strategies for streamlined business success. And I'm super, super excited today. When I first started my business a couple of years ago, the first thing everyone told me is, oh my gosh, you should think about starting a podcast and you need to find some podcasts to guest on. So I'm super excited to have Mary here. I am going to let her introduce herself. She's so amazing. I've learned so many things about podcasts and podcast guesting from her. So Mary, let's hear from you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. This is going to be a fun chat. My name is Mary Chan, founder of Organized Sound Productions, a podcast production company and consulting company. It's a big mouthful sometimes. I started out in radio about just over 20 years ago now, working mostly behind the scenes, making commercials, coaching voices to read the scripts. And so then in 2018, when the industry is, as always, is downsizing, our entire creative department got let go. And, I kind of sit there and you're like, what am I going to do with my life? And you cry about it for a little bit.
Right.
And, I had already been listening to a lot of podcasts at that point. I knew I still wanted to work in the audio field. I just didn't know how unless I moved cities to another city that had a radio station so I could continue to do my job. But I had lived here in Victoria, BC, Canada on the West Coast for about 15 years at that point. I'm like, I don't want to move. This is my home. I had a young daughter at the time. And so my husband kept hearing me complain about the podcasts that I was listening to, where I could hear the edits or I could hear the type of room they were in, if there was a lot of echo and reverb. Or sometimes I could even pinpoint how they're using the microphone, even without any of the visual aspects. And so he's like, just go help them already. Like, clearly they need help. So go find the people and work with them. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, how do I find people? Like, what? So that's essentially how the business was born, was just on a whim. I did some Google searching and I quickly realized this was a thing. People needed that support. And I had that radio background as well. So I was like, wait, I can mesh my two worlds together. And that's how the business was born.
Well, and I love that you have that beautiful radio voice. Like you can almost always tell who had a background in radio just from the voice. I don't know if it's the equipment. I don't know if you're just born to be a radio person. I don't know. But to me,
Like,
well, I'm excited to talk about all of it because I learned so much from you when we met. And I believe I told you that I actually had played with the idea of starting a podcast. I thought about calling it Journey to 100,000. I didn't know what the 100,000 was going to be. Followers, subscribers, listeners, clients, like money. I didn't know. I just thought that sounded like a really cool name. And when I started doing some research on starting a podcast, hosting a podcast, I quickly realized that that was not my cup of tea and decided to leave that there. So those are some of the things that I want to talk about today. I know that in my network, I have several podcast hosts and lots of people that enjoy guesting on podcasts. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about that journey. One thing I have found, like I've looked podcasts up and found several that might have duplicate names. and I've looked some up, and I'm not really sure like what the gist of their podcast is. I'm not really sure like who their target audience is.
Yeah.
And I want to know if those things are truly important and how you go about making sure that you do take care of those things if they are important. So, first things first, let's say I have the ambitions to be a podcast host and I want to start a podcast. What would you say is the number one thing that I should consider before I go down that route?
The why. Because, like you said, a lot of people would be told, hey, you gotta start a podcast. It's the next biggest thing. That's how you're gonna get your word out there. You can just buy a mic, plug it in, start talking. Sounds easy enough, right? It does.
Right.
But it really isn't, because in order for it to be successful, and whatever term that you want to define as success for yourself, is going to need some sort of strategy behind it. So, why do you want to start that podcast is something that I always start with in that foundational piece, because from there, you'll be able to figure out the who you'll be talking to. All the other things that you were just talking about, like naming the podcast, finding out like the who it's for, the description, like all of that stuff will come after you figure out what that why is for wanting to start your podcast tied to your business.
So I will show my ignorance here, but when I was thinking about just starting my podcast, like I thought it would be as easy as going onto one of the platforms, typing in a name, and boom, just streaming things. I didn't realize like, wow, you have to have content. I mean, it's great if you're very much a fly by the seat of your pants person. I am in some ways, but like I also have to have quite a bit of structure. And I realized like I'm gonna have to plan out a calendar for this. Like, and I'm gonna have to find people that are actually interested in listening. And like, what's my purpose, which is what you just talked about. And then the equipment. Like, I didn't even consider equipment that's needed to really host a quality level sound in the podcast. So where do you start when you start looking at equipment? Like, what should you have? What should you consider? And I learned so much from you about sound and what type of room. So what types of things should my friends out there that are starting a podcast or have a podcast and want to make improvements, what should they consider?
Yeah, one of the things that I always talk about is that sound quality, because without that sound quality, people will think of it as like something that is just a hobby. It's not something serious. You're just kind of tinkering around, which can be okay when you're starting out. But I kind of equate it to when you are going to a restaurant. That's one of my favorite analogies. You go to a restaurant, even before you decide which restaurant you want to go to, I'm sure you got like some recommendations, or maybe you've Googled and you're like, you know what? What's this review like? Ooh, this restaurant menu looks good. Oh, it's in a nice neighborhood. And you decide to go. So the equivalent of that is when people are on their podcast apps and they're like searching for maybe a new show, or they're like, ooh, one that's related to one that they already like. Then they see the cover art, which is your podcast logo. And they're like, oh, this looks like fun. You sit down at the restaurant, you look at the menu. You're like, oh, the photos look pleasing. Ooh, this looks really yummy. I love this description. Same with the podcast. You see the cover art, you read the description if there is one, on what the show is about, maybe who the host is. And then your food arrives at the table and you're still like, this looks great. And you take a bite and then you're like, you know what? Something just doesn't quite taste right. It doesn't matter what it could be. It could be more salt, could be too spicy, could be whatever, right? And you're just like, this wasn't a great meal. I'm probably not going to come back to this restaurant. And it is the exact same thing on your podcast. You finally hit play and you're listening to the show and you're like, something just doesn't sound right about it. I can't pinpoint it, but it's hard for me to listen to. I'm just not going to come back to listen to this podcast. And that is your sound quality. So when they hit play, it's your brain starts firing all these synapses right away to create all these like unconscious biases of what you perceive this podcast is going to be about. Does it sound quote unquote professional? Can they
Mhm.
even hear you? Are you far away from your microphone that they can't even hear what you're saying? Are you using your microphone correctly? That sort of thing. And so if they can't hear you great, if the sound quality is quite poor, it's low, you're recording it in like a big empty office space or living rooms or kitchen tables so that there's a lot of hard surfaces. Your voice
Mhm.
is a sound wave. It bounces off those hard walls and then it gets picked up by your microphone. And that's like that echo sound that people hear. Is there a lot of that? Because your brain will then say to you, this is hard to hear. I'm having listener fatigue. Just like Zoom fatigue, we've all got it during the pandemic. There's just too much
Mhm.
Zoom stuff. And we're like, why am I so tired? Why? I'm not going to listen to this. So that's why sound quality is really important. But back to like the specific tech question that you had, it doesn't really matter what microphone you buy. You can buy one that's on sale on Amazon for $100, $50 even. You can get a microphone like mine. This one is the Shure MV7. I love it. I think it's great. It rejects a lot of room noise, so it only records very close, usually about 3 finger widths here. So you don't get a lot of that echo and reverb. If you are in a bigger empty space, you can buy $1,000 microphone. They're all going to make you sound better than your laptop mic, for instance. So I don't think the mic really matters. It's just how you're going to use it and making sure, if you can, buy one that isn't what the industry calls a condenser microphone. So, a condenser microphone is one where it will pick up all the beautiful frequencies in your voice, which is great for like voiceovers and things like that. But the downside of it is that it only works really well in a soundproof room. So, it will pick up every single noise that's in the room. So you want like a dynamic microphone, which is what this is. And so why I'm saying this is great is because it rejects most of that room noise and only pick up your voice that's close to the microphone.
Okay, so I'm so glad we started talking about this because one thing that you taught me, I had one of those really cool headset things that my husband gave me for Christmas. And, it goes around the back of your head and it does
Yep.
have a microphone on it. And so easy to remember, you told me your mouth is here. You want something that picks up sound from here. So could you talk more about that? Like some people might not have a microphone. They might have one of those headsets or they might have the kind that you plug into your phone and it has the microphone down
Yep.
here. Could you just talk a little bit about what you can use if you don't have a microphone?
Yeah, exactly. So you know what? If you already have one of those headsets with the mic, that's totally cool. You know what? I have one here, a cheapy one, It goes around your head and then you've got the mic here. So what you want to do is make sure it's not up. A lot of times people forget and it's like way up there. So your mouth is way down here, so you want to move it down. You don't want it too much in front of you either because it's going to start picking up all that air, the plosives that come out of your mouth. So it hits the microphone and you get a lot of bad popping sounds. So you want to move it just by the corner of your mouth so you don't get all that popping sound, but it's still picking up your voice. So what I like to do is kind of like put my hand in front of my mouth. And if I can still feel the breath coming out of my mouth, then the mic needs to shift over just a hair bit more.
Huh, cool. Okay.
Yeah. And it's the
Okay.
same if you're going to use like those earbuds and they're attached, right, with the little mic that's attached here. If you're going to use those, that works too because that's a microphone. But what will work really well is, again, if you bring it up closer to your mouth, you can maybe just hold on to it here. Don't shift it around too much because it can create a lot of noise. But like just hold it a little bit closer to your mouth so that it's picking up your voice. But and then finally, if you do have one of these microphones, it's the same thing. If you're going to speak right into it and have all that air come out, then it'll be I don't know if you can really hear, but it pops into the microphone. So you want to just again be pivoted slightly away from it so that when you talk, you don't have a lot of air expressed into the microphone to create that popping sound, but still close enough that it's picking up your voice.
So we have a question from Janice, and I
Yeah.
don't want to skip her question, but I have to ask you, if my intention is to only be a podcast guest versus being a podcast host or starting a podcast, is there a difference with the equipment or the microphone that I will need to invest in?
No, I would say if you want to be a guest, some people sometimes say, "Oh, I'm just going to be a guest. I don't really need to invest in a microphone." And yes and no, right? It's kind of like when you're listening to talk radio, when there's people that call in, they're just on the phone. So as a guest, I would say, you know what, it's okay if you're just going to guess every now and then that you don't have like a high quality mic. But again, if this is going to be tied to your business, then it is tied to your brand. And your brand is also your audio brand, how you sound.
Right.
So I would always recommend, especially if you're going to be planning on doing a lot of guesting, to get a microphone of some sort that we have just talked about. So it doesn't have to be $1,000 mic, but get something because it is part of your brand, is how you sound.
So before we went live, I was telling you that I did quite a bit of podcast guesting at the end of last year, the last quarter or so, and then decided to take a little bit of a break from it. It requires, my feeling is that it requires so much energy. As a guest, I feel obligated to bring this energy and this quality to the podcast. And, I told you, like, I have all of the wrong microphones that you tell me, like, no, you don't want to use that. I even bought like this little thing from Amazon. It plugs in to my laptop, but then like here's my laptop and here's the microphone, so it doesn't do any good. Like it's still at the distance of my laptop.
Yeah.
So,
but okay, first I want to say too, like, no mic is wrong. I mean, if you have one of those mics, it's better than the laptop mic still, right? Like it's still a higher quality compared to the laptop mic. So I wouldn't say it's wrong. It's just, okay, maybe you use what you've got. Like I always say, use what you've got. Don't invest in things until you're like, okay, I'm in it. So then I am going to buy like the $200 microphone or whatever, right? So use what you've got. See if you can move that microphone a little bit closer to you. See if you can, if it's just a low thing, stack a couple books. And if you're being a guest and they specifically say there's going to be a video portion, then okay, then we're going to try and figure out how do we not make sure that microphone is too in front of the camera or something like that. But if it's an audio only podcast, then it doesn't really matter where the microphone is as long as it's close to your mouth, right? So, just looking at Janice's comment there, that's one of the things I love doing too, is assessing sound quality. So this is something that I would do. So for example, if you were like, okay, I have this mic, this is the only one that I have, or like she's got a Blue Yeti. It's actually called a Blue Yeti. That is a condenser microphone. I personally do not like that microphone, only because it was one of the very first microphones to be marketed for podcasting before podcasting blew up. And so now it's just become like the podcasting mic, and it's always on sale. It's cheap. It's great, actually. It works really well, again, in soundproof rooms. So if you do have one, I'm not saying throw it out, but what you can do is make sure that the Blue Yeti has different settings. You want to make sure it's on the heart-shaped setting, so that's cardioid. So it's only picking up around, like, it picks up around this much. You can be this close to a Blue Yeti, right? And then it's only going to pick up the heart shape, means it's only going to pick up close to the front of the microphone. So there's different ways to make it work for you, even if you do have a Blue Yeti or another microphone.
So you're giving all of these amazing facts, and I will make a confession. When I met you on a networking meeting, I was like, oh my gosh, Mary is so cool. I really want to connect with her. And we connected. And like I didn't do my research like on who you are or your business until after we connected. And then I was like, oh my gosh, Mary is amazing. She runs this amazing business. Shame on you, Andrea. You should have done more research and been more intelligent in your conversation with Mary. So, Mary, tell us what you do. Tell us if I decide someday to pick up Journey to 100,000 again, tell me why I need to bring you on in building my podcast brand.
So, the podcast production company side is to help you launch the podcast. So, yes, we talk about those foundations, we talk about your why, but then we also build on that too and teach you a workflow that will support how are you going to podcast essentially, because every single podcast is going to be different. And so I tailor it to your capacity, your audience, your message, and then figure out, okay, do you want to produce a podcast that's once a week? Will it work better for you and your audience that it's every other week? And what else do you do aside from just plugging in your microphone and talking? Like, what do I do when I talk? What do I talk about first? That formatting of your show. What do you want to put in your intro? There could be an outro. There's also music. Again, part of your audio branding. We help select the music and put together a trailer for you, scripting as well for the trailer. And then even afterwards, when everything is recorded, and if you want to edit it yourself, I can teach you how to do that as well in a very streamlined way. If you don't, the podcast production side of the business helps you edit and manage all of that as well. So everything from like after you've hit record on that microphone, you can send that audio to me. We can edit it up for you. We can write up your show notes, and your show notes is kind of like the description of the episode. It's all the teaser bits. It's the part
Mhm.
where a listener will read through and maybe say like, hey, what was that book that you mentioned? I want to click on that link for that book. Those are all in the show notes. So we can help create that too. We can help schedule it and make sure it publishes to your schedule, and some, make graphics for you as well. So like it's more than just talking in front of a microphone. And so we help with all of that. And part of that is also figuring out your tech. Which microphone will you buy that fits your room, your space, and how you're going to use it? Do you want a stand on the floor? Do you want a stand attached to your tabletop? Do you want it just a little tabletop mic so that you can pack away easily? There's so many different variations on just buying a microphone that we totally get into, because I'm a little techie geek as well. So there's so many things. There's things to strategize on how to launch that podcast as well. And so there's basically anything podcasting and audio. I'm your lady.
Okay, awesome. I didn't even, when I thought about, my first thought of creating this podcast, didn't even know that there were people that do the amazing things that you do. But now that I've gotten more into it and you've taught me some things, like I'm beginning to make some decisions about podcasts that I listen to or podcasts that I'm interested in guesting on. So let's talk a little bit about it from the guest side.
Yeah.
So I'm a business owner. I have this brand. I have this ideal client and this audience that I'm looking to reach. As a guest, what things should I consider when I'm looking for a podcast to guest on?
You have to have some foundations. Again, more back to the foundations. Like, why do you want to be on this podcast? Why is it that they would make a great connection or a lead for a potential client for you? So, one of the things that I would always ask the podcast host is, who is your listener? What are their demographics? What are their pain points? And then see if that lines up at all with your own ideal listener or ideal client. If they're in a similar realm, then yes, let's get on that podcast. If it's adjacent, that would be a really good connecting piece too. So then when you are speaking on the podcast, you can figure out what their problems are, and you can answer that listener's problems based on what you do and your ideal client. The other thing I would always do too is make sure that you listen to a couple episodes even before you talk with them or seek them out, just to make sure that you do have like a sense of what the energy of the show is like. You have a good grasp of maybe what their ideal listener and their pain points are, so that when you do approach the host and say, there wasn't a connection before, maybe you've just heard their podcast and you really like it,
Mhm.
or somebody introduced it to you and there isn't really a connection. It's kind of going to be like a sales cold call, right? you're going to pitch yourself to this host, this is a great way for you to then say, hey, you know, I I heard your podcast from so and so. They recommended it to me. I love it. I listened to episode blah, blah, blah. And you talked about this, this, and that. And I think that was great because of XYZ. If you are looking for guests, here's how I can help your listener. Because when you take it from that vantage point, a host is always so busy because they've got their show to run and then they have their own business as well, right? So if
Right.
you can tell them exactly how you can help them and help their listeners, I would almost like guarantee you would be a shoo-in if they have the availability for a guest. So you can say, yeah, I listened to so and so episode. I think it was great. It could really tie in with some of the things that I bring to the table. I can help your listener with XYZ. Give them a couple bullet points on the topics that you think will help them out. And then make it easy for them. If you already have a calendar link, send them the calendar link for a quick, hey, let's just meet up and chat if this is appropriate for your audience. Here's my link if you want to quickly do this, or I would love to get some time on your calendar if you want to send me your link. So that's just a great way to start that connection with the host, because a host, honestly, we get stuff all the time in our inboxes for, hey, I want to be your guest. I think I'd be a great fit. Here's my website. Thanks. Not even that sometimes. And you're just like, what is this? I don't know who you are. I don't have time for this. Like, I ignore, I delete, I don't reply, because we get a lot of inquiries all the time. So make it personable. So listen to the show, see if you can figure out who that ideal listener is, and talk about how you're connected to the show and why you like it. Because if you don't even like it, why be on the show, right? So like figure out what it is that you like.
So if I'm starting out my podcast and I receive a request from someone wanting to be a guest on my show, and they do have all of these amazing, like, what are your demographics? If I'm not keeping track of that, like, what's the best way to start gathering analytics on my podcast if I'm not currently doing that? If I'm just doing it because I love it and I enjoy it and I'm not tracking numbers, what is the best way to start? And what are the best numbers to start tracking first?
As a host, you mean?
As a host.
As a host.
As a host.
Okay. Wherever you host your podcast, that's your media hosting platform. So like your website, it's got to live somewhere on the internet, right? So you've got a host for your website. Same thing with your podcast. It's always best to host it somewhere. So that can be Libsyn, it could be Buzzsprout, it could be Acast. There's a whole bunch of different places where you can host your podcast. And within those hosting platforms, there's usually a stats analytics side to it all. So make sure that you are in that tier, because sometimes they're not always included. So there could be a basics tier of just a little bit of information, and then there's also stats where it will pin down to like the city that people are listening from, and how many downloads every 30 days, every 90 days, every 60 days. And so different places will have different types of analytics. So if you're really concerned about analytics, I would take a look at the different platforms that will provide different types of analytics. If you don't have analytics there, but for example, your listeners are listening from Apple Podcasts or Spotify, those platforms have their own analytics too, which are really interesting because they have consumption analytics, which your media hosting platform don't always have. You have to actually go into Apple and Spotify for it. And consumption stats are actually how long somebody is listening to an episode. So for example, if you have an ad in your 60-minute show, you have an ad every single time at the 30-minute mark.
Okay.
And so then you can see in your consumption stats, they'll be listening, drop off at the 30-minute mark, listening. So you can see that people are skipping ahead. So it's stats like that can really become helpful to then say, hey, this is a pattern. It's happening on more than one episode. I think I need to change that ad placement. I either need to change the placement itself, or I need to change the content of that ad. So then the next time you produce an episode, you can make those changes, see if that sticks, if that changes the drop, and then does it work? If it wasn't one of if it wasn't option A, go to option B. You can test things out. And that's a great thing about podcasting is like, it's always going to be a journey. You're always learning something new with each and every episode that you produce. And so with these stats, that just helps you a bit more with things like that. So I don't always say it's about like download numbers or when you're like, oh, I got 10 listeners, yay. Or some people would say, wow, I already have 1,000 listeners, yay. Like there's just so many ways that stats can be skewed in some ways. Stats are only really, really useful for buying advertising. And that's why it was created, because the bigger players were like, hey, we want to sell quote unquote airtime like on the radio. So how do we sell this? Well, it's download numbers, listeners. And so the Interactive Advertising Bureau, the IAB, created the standard of downloads and what you need in order to buy airtime. And so that's why there's download stats. But I think for the regular business person, the download numbers don't really matter. It's more about the intangible aspects of podcasting. So, for example, I have a client who is a facilitator. So she teaches how to create workshops and things like that. She's been running this podcast for like 2 years now, and within her industry of facilitation, there's this big network and this big organization, and they just did their annual report for 2024, and her podcast was listed in the top 5 podcasts in facilitation that you need to listen to. So it's an industry-wide publication, and she was in the top 5. Like, that is saying something, right? It's not about the download numbers. If your industry is really, really niche, you're obviously going to have smaller download numbers. If your industry is huge, then you're going to have bigger download numbers, right? So I don't like to look at stats in terms of download numbers. It's going to be about the other connecting pieces on how are you getting business. So for example, if you go on discovery calls with people, and that's one of the ways that you're getting business in, and they say, oh yeah, I listened to your podcast. Well, there you go. That's a marker of, hey, they listened to you, they liked your show, they already like what you said. It was an easy buy for them. You know, that actually happened to me last month, where someone was like, hey, you sound exactly like who you are on your podcast. I'm like, yeah, that's me. They're like, oh, I love that episode that you did about blah, 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 blah. And then we barely talked numbers, and she was like, okay, send me the proposal. I'll sign it when I get it. And I'm just like, perfect. And sometimes even for me, I still think, how did that happen? But it happened because of the podcast and the branding and all of the stuff that I've done in the background that's just running in the background for people to listen to, right?
So that made me think of a question, but it's like a 2-pronged question.
Okay.
So if I have a podcast and I'm just doing it because I enjoy it, but I decide one day that I really want to be serious about my podcast and I want to take it to another level and somehow monetize it, like what are the considerations I should make in the quality production of my podcast if I decide to take it to another level and an up level? Should I change how would I even go about strategizing how to do that?
So for one, I love doing things like that. So, working with me would be the ideal thing. So then I can take a look at everything from a listener perspective and see, hey, I see this is working for you. Let's keep doing that. I'm missing some pieces here. There's some holes. You can fix that. And then that could take you to the next level, right? So where I could do the auditing for you. If you're going to be doing it yourself, one of the things that I would always say is, if you were the auditor of your show, you have to not take it personally and think about it as, this is not your baby. This is not your little show here, but I am listening to this from a listener perspective. So can I even find it in all the listening apps? because there are so many places that you can listen to a podcast. Just because you like listening to Apple Podcasts doesn't mean that is the only place. Like, I don't have an Apple phone. I'm an Android person.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you find your podcast in all the different places? As a regular listener, how is your podcast interacting with a regular listener? You know, where do you have a website for it? How does that website look? Is it tied to your brand? Audio wise, if you are, most podcast listeners are listening while they're on the go. So if they're on the bus, if they're walking around town, if they're doing dishes, if they're vacuuming, can they still do all of those things and still hear your podcast? So is it recorded at a high enough volume that they can still hear it without having to max out their phone volume to hear your show? Little things like that that I don't think people realize is such an important thing to grow your show, because it's all of those little subconscious things that people never think about. So podcasting is a long game. When you say you want to take it to the next level, like I would even say implement some things, do it for a year, do it for 6 months, do it for a year, and see what that brings for you before making another change. Because it needs to, a podcast listener needs to have multiple touch points with you before they take a lot of action. So they need to hear that repetition. That's what the audio platform is also great for, the intimate connection that you have with your voice, but also that repetition that they need before they're like, you know what, I've heard this show, I love this show, and then I really should sign up for some coaching because I do need it. Like, I get so much value out of your show. I need it. Okay, I'm ready now. You know, you meet them where they're at when they're ready.
So one of the most difficult things as a business owner, when I started my very first business, I was like, oh my gosh, I have this business and I love doing it. And there's all of these people I want to serve and they're going to flock to me and it's going to be amazing. And it does not work like that at all in the beginning. And even parts of the way through, it does not work like that at all. So as a podcast host, give us, not us, because I'm not doing it, I'm leaving it to all of you out there that are so passionate about it. But as a podcast host, what is the best way to engage with your audience, and what strategies would you recommend using to grow your audience base?
Making it easy for them to interact with you. You know, like, do you have a specific call to action each and every time? Again, I'm talking about that repetition piece. Sometimes people need to hear you say your email address 7 times before they will actually email you, right? Is it going to be easy to remember? Is that email address easy to remember? Like, you know, back in the day, phone numbers, people remembered all the phone numbers because they were easy. They were like, 7 digits back in the day. So it's got to be easy. It's got to roll off the tongue easily. So do you have maybe a website that they can go to? Is that website easy to say, so that if it's not easily clickable on the show notes, can they just go, oh, I'm going to look up your show. And then you say, there's a contact page there. But that's multiple steps. If you already know that most of your listeners are going to be, say, on Spotify. Spotify actually has implementing a lot of things and investing in podcasting a lot. So one of the things they did was create a Q&A sort of feature for each episode. So if you know a lot of your listeners are in Spotify, one of the things you could do is customize that question so they can interact with you that way and leave a comment on your show on Spotify. So, you could always say, what was your biggest takeaway of this episode? And then that, leave me feedback, let me know. And then that will be the same one that pops up with each and every episode you publish. Or you can go into Spotify and customize each question. That's a little bit of added work, but it can be handy if you have a very specific call to action that you want to use with your Spotify listeners. YouTube, Google Podcasts is now shutting down this year. And so they're putting all of the podcasts onto YouTube, which also means that it will now also be on YouTube Music. So YouTube Music as a listening app has all the podcasts on there now, and well, most of them because people are still transition. They're in that transition phase. But like Spotify, YouTube Music has a section for comments. Um, or if your show is on YouTube itself, you can specify to leave comments on the YouTube page. So wherever you know that your listener is listening the most, so you don't want to do this for everything, right? It's just like when people say, "Oh yeah, come message me on LinkedIn and Instagram and I'm also on Facebook and TikTok and da 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 da." There's just way too many things. Your call to action, I guess to summarize this question of yours, your call to action really can be only one or two actions. Because if there's too many things you've listed off, as a memory piece, we're not going to remember as a listener. So, is it that email me? Do you have an automatic voicemail? So, for my show, I've set up a voicemail on my website. So, I always say, leave me a voice note. I'd love to hear from you. You can go to visiblevoicepodcast.com and click on the purple button that says send voicemail. So, you actually tell them specifically how to do it. And then every time they hear that, they'll then be like, oh, yeah, right. Oh, I love this show. I want to leave her some feedback. Visiblevoicepodcast.com, purple button, send voicemail, done. Right? So you got to make it easy for them. And what are your one or two call to actions?
As a podcast strategist, all of the tips and tricks and hints that you've given today, is that part of the service that you provide? Will I learn that as a podcast host? Are there resources that you recommend? Like, how can I get all of the knowledge you've given us in 41 minutes into my head if I'm a podcast host?
Perfect place. I was just talking about my podcast. I have a podcast on podcasting. So, late last year, I even did an episode on this whole Google Podcast YouTube integration thing. So if you're like, what were you talking about, YouTube? Well, head back to my podcast. It's called The Podcaster's Guide to a Visible Voice, visiblevoicepodcast.com. It's the one with the purple logo. And if you click on that, you'll find some tips and tricks. I do solo episodes with tips just like this. And I also do interview episodes so that we can get insight from the industry and other podcast hosts and guests as well. So that what's their insight into podcasting right now. So that would be one of the places to go. If you want to work with me, yes, part of the launch the podcast strategy is to dive deep into all these things. So we work one-on-one. I have either a 12-week program that we work one-on-one on. So we go from idea on week 1 through all the tech, the foundations, the marketing, the branding side of things, creating your trailer, all the way by the end of the 12 weeks, you've launched your podcast by then. So we can do it that way, or I can audit your existing show and just give you a report. We can have a call on what's working, what's not working, and up level your show. So there's different ways to work with me, but everything is all on my website, organizedsound.ca.
So I have a couple of questions. Do you have recommendations for a mic in the $100 or less range for a soon-to-be podcast host?
Yes. So one that I like is called the Samson, Samson Q2U. Letter Q, number 2, U. That's a good one. It usually goes on sale too, so it's like $50 sometimes. It's a great one because it is what I was calling not a condenser microphone. It is a dynamic microphone. It's small. It can be handheld, but also comes with a little tabletop stand. And then it extends just a little bit more. So if you need to, just throw a couple books underneath it to make it even that much taller to bring it up. So that would be a good one. Just for you guys, you can go to my website, organizedsound.ca/gear, GEAR. I actually have a running list of some recommendations that I usually have for my clients. So if you want to go there, I've got some low budget, medium budget, and high budget gear recommendations there for you. And the Samson Q2U is listed on there as well.
Thank you, Mary. And Janice, it is being recorded, and I'll take care of you. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of you. So, are there any parting words of wisdom that you have for our aspiring podcast hosts, current podcast hosts, and guests out there?
Yeah, podcasting is meant to be fun. So don't do it just because someone's like, "Hey, you need to have a podcast. That's the next big thing." But if you don't even if you find yourself being overwhelmed with the idea of, "Oh my gosh, I need to create content every week. Like I need to talk about things. What am I going to talk about?" If you're not passionate to talk about a subject for hundreds and hundreds of episodes, you're probably not ready yet at this point to be a host. So make sure it's fun for you. And then when you are having that fun, know that it is a journey. There's going to be some ups and downs. Tech issues always happen. I mean, I'm a tech person, and still every now and then I'll go and record an interview and I'm like, I don't know why this isn't working. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to reboot my computer. I'll be right back. It happens. So it's always going to be a journey. You're going to have fun while you're learning the craft of podcasting. And just know that whenever you listen to a show that sounds amazing, I bet if you go back to their very first episode, episode 1, it's not going to sound as great as where they currently are at. So know that everyone has a learning curve and that you get to learn and then tweak for the next episode to make it that much better.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So, Mary's given us some amazing tips. I plan on getting back into the podcast guesting journey in the very near future. I'm definitely going to go back and watch this again. I tried to write notes while you were talking, but then I got caught up in waiting for the answer and asking the next question. So I'll have to go back and listen. Thank you so much for offering us your wisdom today. I really, really appreciate it. You have so much information in your head. I learn something every single time that I talk to you. This was amazing. If there are any additional questions, how can people get in touch with you to ask questions?
Yeah, so my website is the perfect place to go, organizedsound.ca. I have a contact form there. My email address is there. Or also, I'm usually on LinkedIn as well. So if you want to connect over LinkedIn, you can find me there.
Thank you, Mary. So again, I'm Andrea Swanner. You can always find me on LinkedIn. It's my platform of choice. Thanks for joining Mary and I today to learn a little bit more about podcast hosting and guesting. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. I'll be sure to get them to Mary if she doesn't see them. Continue to send us your thoughts, continue to send us your questions, and stay tuned for the next time we get together and have a chat on podcasting. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great Wednesday.